So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. So let me tell you a bit about our speaker tonight. So we have Pippa Catterall, Professor Pippa Catterall with us, and she's Professor of History and Policy at the University of Westminster. She's editor of National Identities. She's chair of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust. She's published many books, extensively on history and nationalism, most recently on Bollywood and nationalism. Now, this talk derives from her project with the global engineering firm Arup on queering public space and reflects on how we can make public space more inclusive to all. Now, I've been really looking forward to hearing this lecture, so if you'd like to introduce, please, Professor Pippa Catterall.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Good, because it's important to be accessible. I don't know whether this is going to be geography or adventure. It's probably going to be more architecture, actually, but it's very good to be here and to be sharing these thoughts with you this evening. And if you feel like dancing at some point, please, feel free. What I'm going to try and do is talk about how we can make public space more inclusive for everyone. I start with a disclaimer. I called the talk Public Space for All. I do not have the illusion that we can make all spaces 100% accessible and inclusive. There are buildings which are old. This is an example, and as Betty was telling me downstairs, thanks to the Admiralty, we have a lift in here, but that makes it more accessible. That's good. I was talking recently as a result of a project I'm doing with Transport for London about their attempts to make step-free access throughout the London tube system, and they said, yeah, London, if you think about it, think about how much stuff there is below the surface. You cannot put a lift shaft in Baker Street tube station. There is just nowhere you can actually put it. So there are some places, however much you want to, retrofitting these spaces is never going to work. There are some examples where okay. There are some examples where some people may feel more comfortable with certain forms of design than others. So we may need to think about how do we make these spaces as accessible as possible, and what can we do to make them more inclusive and more safe for people. Just before I came over here, I went to the pub, as you do, and we were in the Raven just over there, and I thought, isn't it great that you can see a woman breastfeeding in a public space, which is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act 2010. There are lots of problems with the Equality Act 2010, and we know that there are lots of political pushback on the Equality Act of 2010. But it's still good to see people exercising that protected characteristic and being able to be themselves in public space. So, and that's one of the examples I'm going to try and use from this region. And I will try to have examples which will be familiar to people, though I expect this one probably isn't. Has anyone ever seen this, apart from me? So this is in Margate, and you walk along the seafront in Margate and you suddenly go, oh, that's nice to see something like this. Now this is something I would call queering a space, because it's changing the ambience of the space. It's giving a different kind of vibe to it, because what you would expect to see there is no loading or no parking or something like that, not never stop dancing. That's also why on that poster for the talk I'm giving tonight, I use something which I spotted in Clifton in Bristol a few years ago, where you get to the top of this long hill. It's a steep hill, which you can only walk up, and at the top of the hill, there is a bus stop. You couldn't get a bus down there, but there's a bus stop there, and right opposite the bus stop is that little sign, which I'm not going to be showing in the slides tonight, which says, "You still are so beautiful." And it's on this sign, which looks like it's going to be saying "no loading." And I thought, this is great, because it's just queering the space, it's changing the ambience of the space. So, and what I'm trying to do here is use the word queering not as a noun, but as a verb, in the sense of disrupting the way in which we understand a space, disrupting our sense of the structures, of the assumptions, of the stereotypes, and of the spaces that we inhabit, and in the process making them more protean, amorphous, flexible, adaptable, diverse, and inclusive. That's not the only thing I'm going to be talking about today, but it is one of the things that I want us to think about because it's not just about legislation, it's not just about building to code. I mean, I give this talk to a lot of architecture groups, and you end up talking about, well, building to code is fine because you tick all the boxes, but it doesn't necessarily make it work for the people who are living there. What you're essentially doing is ticking the boxes for some bureaucrat. But if we think about it, the British Standard 8300, which is entitled Inclusive Design, was published in 2018. It's 7 years old. It needs updating. They're conscious that it needs updating. It's only really about accessibility. So it's about how you get into spaces, not about how you feel once you're in them, not about the ambience of a space, not about the safety of a space. It's largely about physical accessibility. And it's important to go beyond that and think about how can we make public spaces safer and more inclusive and better to live in and work in and be in. So, and of course, when we're talking about inclusivity, we also need to bear in mind that what's the opposite of inclusive? Exclusive. Yeah. Is this an inclusive space? Anybody tell me? This is in Somerset, by the way. Anyone feel included by this? Anyone feel excluded by it?
It reminds me of the Danes who have their flag. They use it a lot, and I don't know if the question for them comes up about inclusivity.
It's an interesting point. Someone actually painted what they thought was an England flag on a roundabout recently, but they got it wrong and then painted the Danish flag instead, because they just got the colours the wrong way around. Now, I'm colourblind, but I'm not that colourblind. So I actually think this is quite cute. There have been, you may have noticed there's been a kind of epidemic of flags recently. And I think to some extent, the intention is exclusive. I think if we respond to it by seeing it as exclusive, we're actually making the situation worse. So I'm quite glad I didn't end up talking on the Today programme about it a couple of weeks ago when they asked me. But I think this is actually quite playful as a way of thinking about it. There is a potential problem, though. I mean, if you're walking on the national flag, how much are you actually respecting it? Is this a way of saying, we're really proud of our flag, please walk on it? It's a slightly problematic approach. There was a case of, the street bollards you see, where sort of keep light. People have painted these on a street, on one of those, and then people turned them into Battenberg cakes. Uh, that's queering it, I think. Though it's probably not intentional. One of the things I think we want to think about is how do you signal through representation inclusivity? I mean, we recently did, as part of the project I'm involved in, a survey of people around the world, and one of the examples we showed them was a gayborhood, a queer neighbourhood with lots of gay bars and so on. And people were responding by going and saying, well, in one level, it's quite inclusive to see lots of pride flags and progress flags and so on. On the other hand, I might actually feel less safe there because it can signal to people this might attract predators, people who come to gay bash, because they know that's where they can find us. So there's always a question about how does representation actually work in practice when we look at these kinds of sites. What we do know, though, is that you can have a sense of, does the space make you feel more included or less included? Do you ever, people in this room, do you ever walk into a building and think, or is this a safe space? Do I feel comfortable here? Does everyone feel that? Or is it just me? Yeah, so, and I mean, the example I sometimes use is, you may recall a couple of years ago when Robert Jenrick was a senior minister in the Conservative government, he ordered a detention centre for children down on the south coast of Kent to paint over the Disney figures because they looked too welcoming. So inclusivity for him was a bad thing. I tend to respectfully disagree with him. I think one should try and signal inclusivity, which can include things like public art, as well as things like code, things like British Standard 8300 and so on. So how did I get into all of this kind of thing? I started off by getting interested in this project by having a conversation with a young architect who also happens to be a Syrian refugee. And we were talking one summer at the Historic England Garden Party. And I happened to mention that I'd recently seen a play called Love Song to Lavender Menace. Lavender Menace was the first gay bookshop in Scotland. Homosexuality was only partially decriminalised in Scotland in 1980. Lavender Menace, which is a reference to the way in which gay people were demonised in the US during the Cold War, was founded in 1982. And the play starts out with this guy sidling through the Georgian streets of Edinburgh, trying to get to this gay bookshop, and he goes, the opening line is, "Fuck me, even the buildings are homophobic." Sorry about the Scottish accent, and possibly the expletive as well. So you had this, and I thought, how can a building be homophobic? How can spaces be homophobic? How can spaces be intolerant of our experience? And is there something about the ambience of a space which might either help to trigger violence and exclusivity or promote inclusivity? Are there things we can do to desist hate crime and make these spaces easier to live in? And you start thinking about that. And there was a guy who lived in Edinburgh, lived right at the top of the Royal Mile, in fact, called Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes was one of the founders of the town planning movement. Some of you may have heard of him. He was originally a biologist and biology and town planning are obviously organically related. Um, he was one of the architects of the idea that we should build what became the suburban estates of post-war England and America, where you built 3-bedroom houses for families with 2.4 children, which then became very heteronormative estates where people who stood out because they didn't have children could be demonized. So created, and Geddes did this quite deliberately, created spaces which were designed for a particular type of person rather than for diverse communities, and not necessarily reflecting the life cycle of communities, the way in which we grow older, we have different needs as we grow older, you have different kinds of housing requirements. As queer people age, very often they end up having to go back into the closet when they go into care homes, and so how do we deal with all of those kind of issues as well? And then there is the question of, when we walk into a building, do we find it intimidating? Does anyone find this building intimidating? Maybe not. Well, we're all here, so we'll manage to cross the threshold. Has anyone heard the concept of threshold fear before? So threshold fear is a term which is used by museum professionals. It was coined in 2005 by someone called Elaine Gurian. It seems that architects are not terribly familiar with it yet, at least from the various documents I've been reading for REBA recently. But I think threshold fear is actually quite common, the sense that you walk into a room like this and you go, well, am I wealthy enough to actually sit in here? Do I feel welcome here? Will I be out of place? Will I pick up the wrong fork or something like that? Am I the right kind of person to go into one in the Royal Crescent? Or will I feel out of place in those kinds of places? So buildings have an ambiance which conveys who can actually be in these places. And if you think about it, a lot of buildings are designed to convey an ambiance. If you look back to the 18th century, the ideas which informed the design of the old Newgate prison, which they pulled down at the start of the last century, came from France, and the idea was this is built to intimidate. What a surprise, it's a prison. So can anyone suggest other buildings which are designed to convey authority? Courthouses, yeah. Banks are designed to convey your money is safe here. They're not necessarily, and of course historically a lot of banks, most people couldn't afford to have a bank account. So it was a way of saying, you're too working class to come in here, so stay away. You people on weekly wages and so on. Courts, police stations. Has anyone ever seen an inclusive looking police station? No? Surprising that. Any other examples? One of the charities I think is really interesting is called Hospital Rooms. Hospital Rooms works with mental health institutions, and I went to their, I think, 10th anniversary talk a year or so ago. One of the members of their committee was saying, there I was, I had been sectioned, I was in this room with broken windows, dead plants, cracked walls, the room looked dead, and I was dying inside. And the design of the space just made me feel terrible. It wasn't designed to be uplifting. Has anyone ever seen Maggie's Rooms? Anyone seen any Maggie's Rooms? So some people are nodding. Maggie's, this is one designed by Thomas Heatherwick recently, I think, in Scotland. And these are designed to be funky, inclusive, enjoyable, and sensory stimulating spaces for people who are in palliative care. And I think, if you think about it with a lot of hospitals, how many hospitals do you think of as being really inclusive? Someone said to me not so long ago, you know why hospitals' corridors are designed the way they are? So that you can have two people, one person between two other people who are restraining them. They're not designed to say, yeah, have a great time here. And so, again, we need to think about how do we get around the kind of ambience that this is conveying. And then we have the question of inclusivity in open public space. So we've got two examples here. We've got public transport and a public street. This is from last year. You may recall something happened in Southport last summer. I know someone who is the head of the Crown Prosecution Service for Southport. He was very busy after that incident, prosecuting these kind of people. This is not a good use of public space. It's not terribly inclusive. What a surprise, Islamophobic hate crime peaked last year. Record numbers of Islamophobic hate crime. But of course, all kinds of hate crimes in recent years have been going up. Anti-Semitic hate crime last year was the second highest ever. It's probably gone up again. We also know that hate crime is hugely underreported. Only about 20% of hate crimes actually get reported to the police. When you do surveys of people, lots of LGBTQ people, for instance, do not report to the police because they don't think they're going to be taken seriously. And then the other one. So this is actually a picture from Bristol Live, but it illustrates a case which happened in Sunderland in 2017. It was a case which went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's about which should be more important on a bus. A woman with a buggy, in this instance, though it could be a man with a buggy, of course, or someone in a wheelchair. Which would you go for? You are the Supreme Court. What would you go for? Don't all speak at once. Better designed buses, yeah, I mean, that's true, but you can see there's an accessibility ramp on this bus, so it's not too bad. But, I mean, the article which talked about this also mentioned, this is 2017, coming out of a pub in Bristol, seeing a man who'd booked a cab which was supposed to be disability friendly, had a ramp to it, 6 cabs turned up, and 6 of them drove away again because they couldn't be bothered to load a disabled man into their cab because they would make more money moving on more quickly and taking other fares. So, there's an issue there, but which one would you go for? The buggy or the wheelchair?
I think they go for the wheelchair because the buggy, you can take the child out before the buggy down.
That's exactly, have you read the judgment? That's exactly what they did. Yes, yeah, so someone in a wheelchair doesn't have a choice. Someone with a buggy does have a choice. I mean, the case came from a woman, because a woman refused to allow someone in a wheelchair onto a bus in those kind of circumstances. So, there are cases which can lead to litigation. There are cases where you're still trying to clarify how the regulation should work. But I'm all for protesting, and I deprecate the way in which recent governments have made it more difficult to protest in this country. But I think there's protesting and throwing things and committing criminal affray, which is what seems to be going on here. And there's a question of how you calibrate the law to allow these kinds of things? What should we allow in public space? This is one of the reasons why you raised the question, what does public space for all actually mean? Because in the end, we're talking about what is licensed to take place in public space and how much license do you give? I used to live in a village where there were, I don't know, probably about half the commercial premises in that village were licensed premises. 46 licensed premises in one village. They thought of having a triage unit there on a Friday night at one point. It was that bad. People did get killed in that village in drunken riots and things like that. So you end up saying, well, you know, there's clearly a problem here. If you have a huge number of licensed premises which are not effectively managed, and you know, to be fair, I know that the Licensing Act 2003 does impose new duties on publicans and licensees to manage their premises effectively and so on. I was talking the other day to the wonderfully named Michael Kill, who is the Chief Executive of the Nighttime Industries Association. And he said, well, yeah, we have training. A lot of people still need to be trained. And just training people into how to manage bars is not sufficient because it doesn't stop aggro happening once people have left the bars. And frequently the problems are not in the bars, it's in the spaces outside. So it's how you manage those as well. And then there's a question, well, whose space is it anyway? Virtually every country on the planet is signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Not all countries actually observe them. A few years ago, I published an article with Caroline over there about COVID, the management of COVID in this country, and the extent to which the UK government during the pandemic didn't comply with SDG 3, which is the duty of protecting your citizens when it comes to healthcare. SDG 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. Well, that sounds good. We should all be working on that. Matthew Carmona at the Bartlett School in University College London talks about there's a need for planning to reflect a diversity of lifestyles, preferences and needs amongst urban populations, which might include things like, can you express affection in public space? Can you? Should you be able to? Denmark is probably more accepting of same-sex relations than the UK. A survey in 2018 in Denmark found half of the people there would not hold, half the gay people in Denmark would not hold their partner's hand in public because they'd be afraid of being attacked. Friend of mine was indeed attacked on the London Tube not so long ago for showing affection to his boyfriend. So we're not talking about having sex on the tube, we're talking about just showing affection. So what is actually allowed in public space? What can you do? I'm sorry, just to go back to that. This is a plot which you can find on the South Bank in London, and it says, in 1934, King George V decreed the children of London have free access forever to the beach. And this is all about reclaiming spaces, because so much space has been privatised. So much space is owned by public corporations now, and they police what you can and cannot do in them. And then there's the question of what happens when you design particular kinds of things. So these are about all the risk factors which are increased for women when it comes to protecting them in cars, particularly pregnant women. Seatbelts are not designed for pregnant women. Airline seats are not designed for women. Tube trains in London are not designed for women. There's a great report which came out from, I think, Atkins a few years ago by Stephanie Burton called The Gender Data Gap. about all the different things which are not designed for women. They're just designed around some kind of male norm. And that includes the way in which transport systems are calibrated. So transport systems in this country are designed around a male breadwinner norm. The assumption is men commute into the city and commute back again. Women all over the world tend to travel more, shorter journeys, more on public transport, have less access to private transport. And as you can see on the slide, women, global majority people, disabled people, poorer people, less likely to own a car, which constrains their ability to engage in mobility. And then we can talk about the levels of street harassment and gender-based violence. If you're a member of a global majority community, you're 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched in the street in England and Wales. One of our black PhD students said to me not so long ago, "Have you ever been followed around a shop?" I said to him, "I don't think so." He said, "Trust me, you haven't, you're white." And whereas I get followed around shops all the time, this guy was impeccably middle class, but the wrong colour. So you have all of these kinds of things which affect people's equity in public space because of the differential way in which they work. This picture surprised me because it came from the Daily Mail, but it to me is a wonderful illustration of manspreading, and the way in which she's sitting there like this, trying to do her makeup whilst all these men are slobbing around her. But you've got, as the quotations there, and this comes from a report in Scotland, many women are more dependent upon public transport. They're more likely to be frightened on public transport. Lighting on public transport is sometimes a problem. So if you look at this, the lighting in here is actually not bad. This is actually ambient light, so it's quite warm light. That's not, that's a very cold light. That kind of light is quite intense. It produces pools of light and dark, so it's not necessarily safer, but very often you'll talk to people. I mean, I spent the last 5 years trying to get people to understand it's not the intensity of light, it's the quality of light that matters when you're trying to make spaces safer. And of course, also you get people who can feel responsible for their own safety and find it difficult to explain why it's difficult to access spaces. Well, of course, you can also have spaces which feel wonderfully inclusive. This is a ghost silent disco tour of Bath, and it looks like they're having a good time. Probably at a hen party from what they're wearing. So nighttime inclusion is really important, but one of the things we could think about with this is every local authority under the Equality Act 2010 has a public sector equality duty, part of which is to plan how do you manage space, how do you make those spaces safe at night, how do you make disability access, and most of these reports are not up to date. Most of them haven't been regularly reviewed, and it's important that they are. So anyone who's connected with Baines, you can probably check with them to make sure that their one is up to date. I did actually look at Bath's inclusive design papers, which I wasn't terribly impressed with, I'm afraid. I thought they again majored primarily upon accessibility. And then we have, here's a pub in Bath, I don't know which one, someone might recognise it. It's apparently one of the best bars in Bath though. So many venues still overlack accessibility, or they treat it as an afterthought when they're designing or retrofitting a space. We need to be thinking about access. We need to be thinking about how you move across spaces, so transit once you're in a space, which includes therefore wayfinding. How do you find your way across a space, which may not always be terribly inclusive? You need to think about how the signage works. You need to think about who's represented in these spaces. Now, Wales has got a programme at the moment of putting in statues to women, because they've got a programme of putting 5 statues to Welsh women, because they didn't really have any. There were, until recently, I think Scotland had 20 statues of women who weren't Queen Victoria. Because of course, the only statue of a woman you ever find anywhere is Queen Victoria. So, as a way of signalling inclusivity, signalling the kinds of people who are valued in these spaces. Lower bar counters. I was doing an EDI audit of our campuses recently, and I went into one of the cafes with someone from Estates, and I said, well, this is great, you've got these things you can plug your laptop into, but they're here. If you're in a wheelchair, you can't actually reach them. So, not much use, really. You need to think about the spatial syntax of the space. You need to think about the nature of the lighting. You need to make sure that the toilets are accessible, which is frequently not the case. And usually men have far more toilet facilities than women. And you need to have very clearly marked evacuation patterns. We also need to think about inequities when it comes to just the quality of the air we breathe. Anyone know where the most dangerous age to be on a street is when you're about that tall? Because when you're about that tall, on a busy street, the car fumes are going straight in your lungs. So we have a society in which we talk about children and caring for children, but some of the people who talk about caring for children are also terribly pro-car, and you go, but it's your children who are breathing in these fumes. As you can see here, lots of the UK has poor air quality, and even in rural areas, even in rural Somerset, for instance, the poorer you are, the worse your air quality, everywhere in the country. So moving on to, well, let's try and get happier and think about how do we improve this kind of space. You all know where this is? Yeah, Bristol Cathedral. I took this picture a few years ago because I think this is actually really a nice space. I could have shown you a picture of Bradford, Centenary Square in Bradford, which I think is a horrible space. It's just been redesigned, but it's got law courts right next to it. It's got those authority structures you were talking about. You don't have people sitting on grass. It's very, very concrete. It's very grey. I mean, it's Yorkshire, so it's grey in the skies as well. You need to alleviate those kinds of structures and make it a bit more engaging. This has got greenery. It's also curvilinear. On this side of the green, you've got the City Hall. And the City Hall has got these kind of queer things on it, like the unicorns on the top of the City Hall. Great. And the City Hall itself is a curvilinear design with water in front, so it breaks up the space and makes it feel more inclusive. But it is, of course, what I would call an authorised space. It's designed to convey a certain sense. And what I call authorised public space discourse is, we're not just talking about design, we're talking about who owns the land, how is it policed, what are the furnishings of it, how is it licensed, how do you manage homelessness, A lot of hostility towards homelessness now. How is it taxed? Because I also sit on the Valuation Tribunal for England. And who gets commemorated within these spaces? How easy is it to retrofit these kinds of spaces as well? So I took this picture just outside Winchester Cathedral a couple of years ago, and what you can see here is these young people have moved this bench so that they can sit talking to each other. We were talking earlier about how women prefer sitting and talking to each other. I did a talk entitled Where Do You Cry in an Open Plan Office a couple of years ago for Westminster City Council. And one of the pictures I showed in that was two women sitting and talking over a coffee, and another man sitting there with his laptop staring into the distance. And you're going, okay, this, I mean, maybe a slightly stark illustration of the different ways in which men and women engage with spaces. But we certainly know that women tend to prefer more social seating like this. I mean, that's a very small example of people, if you like, retrofitting a space. That comes from the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago, where they actually mimicked an ATM and gave people a whole load of choices about what would you do to this space, how would you want to change it to make it work better for you. And of course, sometimes that's easier, sometimes it's much more difficult to change spaces and make them work better. So many of our public spaces are a Victorian legacy. In Victorian times, a lot of public spaces, women were not supposed to be in them. Women's toilets were not provided in a lot of Victorian cities. And if you did see women in the street, you were probably working class or a working girl, if you know what I mean. And so there is a very different kind of ambience to these spaces, and there's a question of how can you change them. But even if we take post-war design, there's a challenge as well. So the black and white picture is Birmingham, Auto City in the 1960s. And what you've got there is all of the, they turned it into a city for the car. You've got all these underpasses and so on. A lot of them were really inaccessible for people pushing buggies, people in wheelchairs and so on, because they didn't think about that. They prioritised the car in the design of the city. And Birmingham has now been painfully going through a process of retrofitting all of this to make it easier for pedestrians to traverse it. This side is from Vienna. This is an area of Vienna which is known as Frauenstadt. It's Aspern in Vienna, one of the suburbs. It's called Frauenstadt because it's designed by and for women. So, and there are other examples I could have pointed to in Stockholm, where the stations have been designed by women, the traverse has been designed by women, the social housing has been designed by women, all to try and make sure that these are actually more inclusive spaces. There is no equivalent in the UK yet of Frauenstadt, just like there is no equivalent yet of what there is in Vienna called a queer city pass, where you can actually make spaces more LGBTQ friendly as well. But that's not to say that we can't aspire to do those kinds of things. So how can we make spaces more inclusive and responsive? Obviously, there's a lot about access, but we also need to think about the architecture of the senses. So when you look at this space, does this space look good or bad? Bad? Anyone think it looks good? This is a new build in Bermondsey, just near Tower Bridge. About 100 yards up there, this corridor, there's a pub. So I took this at this end of here. You could hear people in the pub very clearly, 100 yards away, because this is a wind corridor. So you get dust blowing down here, the soundscape is really intimidatory, and the architects don't seem to have thought about that. It's important to think about all of the senses, the haptic, the aural, the olfactory, as well as the visual, when you're designing these spaces. Whereas architects often focus primarily upon the visual. We need to think about what kinds of presumptions are embedded in design. We also need to think about the way in which developers are frequently thinking about a quick buck rather than the long-term sustainability of the developments they produce, which means we need to think about differential uses and spaces. Not just designing, as Geddes suggested, for families with 2.4 kids. We need to think about who gets represented, who gets remembered, where is heritage. I was commenting yesterday for the Royal Institute of British Architects on their new appendix for the inclusive design overlay. And one of the things I said in that is that you could be using something called querying the map, which is a global tool which allows people to put pins on a map to say, there's a piece of queer history which goes in here, but you could also be using things called history pin, which you can then incorporate into the lived experience and the history of a space in order to make a space into a place, into something that people have some kind of heritage attachment to. We can talk about designing in diversity, making the spaces more flexible and more organic. This is, I think, a hugely over-designed space. It's very difficult to personalize these spaces and make them feel like it's, this is my space. Because there's no room for organicism there. Whereas if you design in the ability for people to personalise it, you can make it more inclusive. I've used the word usualising there. Has anyone come across that term before? Apart from you. Usualising is a term which originates with Schools Out, which is the organisation which runs LGBT History Month. And usualising is an alternative to normalising. What's the problem with normalising? It implies there's a norm. It implies that people should conform to the norm. Whereas if you go usualising, you go, humanity contains all kinds of people in all kinds of sizes, with all kinds of needs, all kinds of capabilities, and they're all valuable. And we should value all of them and treat them all as usual. That's so there's if you like, a linguistic transition that we're going through there. We need to think about how can we design spaces to reduce the trigger incidents which create hate crimes. We know that some hate crimes are opportunistic. We know that people who, there's not enough research on hate crimes, surprisingly, but we do know certain things. So we know that people who perpetrate hate crimes frequently hunt in packs, and deliberately so. I was at a briefing in Soho the other day for the owners of gay bars in Soho, and they were saying, what are the police doing about the fact that we actually see gangs of people standing in the street waiting to follow people when they leave Soho so they can beat them up? Because what they're doing, they won't beat them up in Soho because there's too many people who will see it. They wait until you get to a liminal space to do those kinds of things, which also indicates that gayborhoods, places like Soho or Canal Street in Manchester, Bristol's probably got a gayborhood, but I'm afraid I'm not sufficiently familiar with it, are not necessarily the solution to creating public space for all. And then, of course, there's something called hostile design. Have you all heard of hostile design? So here are some examples of hostile design. That one's probably the most commonly known one. How do you stop people sleeping rough? Well, you don't actually. You just get them to sleep in a more uncomfortable way. That's good, isn't it? We know that if you create hostile design, it doesn't make spaces feel safer. It makes them feel less safe because it immediately says to people, this is a dodgy area. Do you know what this does? What this is designed to do? This is pink lighting. Pink lighting apparently makes acne more visible. That's why they do it. Bizarre, I know. This one is from Australia. No, hang on. No, it's Visegrad. And what you can see here is you've got high intensity and high level security lighting, which is creating a series of pools of light and dark. This is not safe because not only do you not feel safe, but when you go into those high intensity pools of light, you feel really visible to anyone who's outside the penumbra of the light. And there could be a lot of those. So more ambient lighting where you can see, but not necessarily be seen, is probably safer. Which brings us on to what we call the security paradox. So in our first report came out in 2021. We did a second report which came out last year called Queer Perspectives on Public Space. And the security paradox is set out here. Respondents were slightly more inclined to see traditional security features as making a space less safe. CCTV and hostile architecture makes these spaces feel uncomfortable. What you want to feel is more safe. One respondent noted, I need somewhere where I can see the whole room and the exits, but I myself can't be immediately and obviously viewed. In an earlier study by the American architect Sarah Nusser, she talks. One of her respondents talked about the importance of not having to edit myself when I'm in public space, because then I'm immediately visible and I feel very vulnerable to anyone who might want to beat me up. So I took this photo, this is near Euston in London, of what struck me as being something that some of our respondents held up as that kind of face-to-face seating we were talking about earlier. People kept on talking about what we want is cosy corners where we can see out, but we're not necessarily very visible. One of the things which came out from our research was the importance of breaking up spaces. Spaces where you can be seen from a very long way away can feel actually really intimidating. Whereas where you've got a lot of variation, it makes it more difficult to pick out things, spaces which are sensory rich and varied. So how do we produce more inclusive design? Well, I don't know what you think of Bristol City Council building, but the kinds of things that's come out from our research is avoiding a neighbourhood effect. One of the things which can produce, the research suggests that one of the things which produces hate crime is the sense that you don't belong here. So if you look at hostility to people who are of a different colour, for instance, very often that hostility is at the highest in areas with very low levels, but increasingly visible levels of global majority people. Once you get more people moving into these areas, they become usualised, and the fear and the unfamiliarity starts to go down. Same kind of thing happens with LGBTQ people on a housing estate where they go, you're the only ones not with a family, this kind of thing. There's the issue of how do we encourage people to be upstanders, not bystanders? So again, we know that hate crime, a lot of people who commit hate crime assume that everyone else in the room will approve of the hatred they're expressing to their victim. So avoid, and I've seen people being victimised on public transport and so on, avoiding that kind of thing in a way which is safe is a really important thing to do, and trying to think about how do we signal that it's safe to do that this is appropriate. Avoid pinch points. I was talking to some people from British Transport Police not so long ago, and they were saying, well, we've been gradually redesigning the various London termini. If you look at somewhere like London Bridge, you used to have really narrow entrances where everyone's being funneled through at peak commuter times. Funnily enough, that's when you get fights. If you make transition easier for people, if you make the wayfinding easier, you get less aggro. You get less abuse for staff, you get happier commuters and so on. So avoid pinch points. Avoid homogeneity, because again, if you have very homogeneous spaces and you have people who stand out, whether it's because they're black or brown or queer or disabled, because disabled people get a lot of hate crime, then avoiding homogeneous spaces can be a way of doing that. And you can use things like colours, variety. You need to think about which colours to use. We need to think about the transition between different colours. So when I was doing my EDI audits of our campus, I was saying, look at the lift shafts. The carpet next to the lift is this kind of colour. The lift shaft, you stand into the lift and it's black. So for some people with neurodivergence, it's like stepping into a black hole. So that kind of transition is probably best avoided. You need to make transitions easier for people. Queer people often like very bright colours, so sometimes it's a question of how do you get a colour palette which meets those bright colours, but also avoids things like red, which we've known forever. Certain types of red are very good at getting people angry and triggering and so on. So how do you come up with calming colours which also can convey inclusivity? Break up spaces, think about soundscapes, think about natural features or water features, and think about how the lighting conduces to seeing but not being seen. How do we deal with things like safety at night? Collecting data which is gender sensitive. Don't just think about metrical analysis. So, look how many cycle lanes we've built. It's not the length, it's the quality of them, where you've actually built them. I used to be on a local authority in London where we had cycle lanes which were 40 metres long. What's the point of a cycle lane which is only 40 metres long? Some of them were shorter than that, actually. Improve bus networks, but also improve the utility of bus networks. We've lost millions of miles of bus routes in this country since Margaret Thatcher, and the way in which she changed, deregulated buses, with the consequence that accessibility in rural areas has really gone down. I live in rural Kent. The bus routes around where I live are crap. So it's really hard for people. Conduct gender safety audits, because you need to think about, well, the safety for different kinds of people in these spaces. In our surveys, we found, well, men frequently didn't think about the safety issues because it's not an issue for them. but trying to get them to understand the way in which other people navigate space is part of the challenge. I have nearly finished, you'll be pleased to know. I know. This, of course, is a hospital. I've already talked about the need to avoid long blank walls. So in the last survey we did, we showed various examples, and one of the examples was a hospital, not this one. And people said, well, long blank walls reinforce the message that hospitals are about procedures, not people. They're often disorienting, they're often not welcoming. It's often quite difficult to see where you get into a hospital or where you go once you move through a hospital. We need to think about how you make public space more inclusive. Which of these posters looks the best? Which of these would you most like to see in public space? Which one? The middle one. Really?
Yes. No. Which would like to see some? That's the one you see a lot.
That's the one you see a lot, particularly in London. To me, that hand is really aggressive and abusive. It's a very negative message because it immediately says abuse of our staff happens all the time. So I don't think it's very positive. The other two pictures come from Liverpool, and I think they're rather more positive messages. And there are also examples of the way in which I've been talking about trying to queer public space by having positive messages in it. To finish, this is my last slide. Thank goodness. This is the Temple Quarter in Bristol. We actually used this as one of our examples in the 2024 survey. And it was really interesting that people responded to it. It's a fairly new build. I think Arup were actually involved in it. And they said, yeah, it's great because on one level, it looks quite inclusive. It's obviously very well used. People are sitting around enjoying themselves. But of course, this is during the day in summer. Let's imagine it at, say, 8 o'clock at night on a wet November evening. Does it feel as good? It's also, you're all looking down, so you've not got face-to-face seating. It's very much an amphitheatre style without actually being an amphitheatre. In terms of wheelchair access, you've got this long windy road to get down it. It's overlooked by massive buildings, so you feel surveilled. It's okay, I think, but it could be better. And there are things we could think about. And I haven't got to the point where I'm going to say, okay, here's a toolkit, this is what you do. And indeed, I don't think one can be that prescriptive. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all to all of these kinds of things. But I do think there are certain considerations which can be included in order to make both the design and the regulation of public space more inclusive, more safe, more welcoming, and better for everyone, not least marginalised groups. And I hope I've given you some thoughts about that. Thank you very much for being so patient with me.
Thank you so much. We did have a run, but I didn't want to stop you because it was so interesting. So if you've got any quick questions, because we have run out of time, but does anyone like to ask Pippa something? Yes.
One of the things you mentioned several times was making spaces where you can see but not be seen. That's also exactly the space that predators want. And I manage a large area of largely woodland in which children play, and we have constant anxiety about the fact this is also public space where the children are overlooked and can be watched by potential predators. How do you balance those two factors? I've been in parks where all the trees have been cut off at kind of 6-foot level, so you can see right across the park. There's no unseen spaces, which isn't what I would want in our woodlands, but it's a difficult one to balance.
It is. As I said earlier, I don't think there's a perfect solution to all of these things. I mean, the other thing that sometimes happens is people cut the lower branches off and push the canopy up so that you've got more low-level sight lines. I agree that predators don't want to be seen either, but predators are often in groups rather than so. Leaving aside the more notorious cases, a lot of predators are hunting impacts. A lot of it is opportunistic. A lot of them are also cowards. So if they're also visible, then you can deter them from committing crimes. So what I'm talking about, I suppose, is reducing the extent to which you can see people and pick out people who you want to go and attack, having more visually rich vistas in which you're not necessarily spotting people that you might want to attack anyway, and trying to make spaces feel safer, where you're not feeling that you can be spotted from a long way away and then people can decide that they're going to attack you, and whilst also having a fair amount of space where if anything does happen, there's not this huge emptiness. I mean, you think about it, some big open spaces in our cities are actually quite empty at night, or the only people in them are all people of the same type. So people of the same age, people of the same ethnicity and so on. They are monocultures. Whereas if you've got more diverse spaces, now I appreciate that's not necessarily very easy when you're talking about woodland or parkland. But if you've got a reasonable kind of cordon sanitaire around these spaces, arguably you could make them safer for people. But I'd need to come and have a look at your space before I could give you a more definitive answer. So will that do for now? Thank you.
Any more
Yes,
questions?
here.
Yeah, I understand fully what you're saying about obviously the architecture and how you make these spaces safer, but surely the root cause is actually education of people to start off with, to not actually put people in a position where they feel unsafe. So is there anything like going into schools and on the curriculum from children from a very young age to actually educate them that, you know, women are valued? You know, me and my friends always have to do WhatsApp locator when we're going home. Men never think to do things like that. So is there anything longer term looking at going on the curriculum to actually educate people at a much, much younger age to actually stop this? And then, you know, the architecture is important to make places safer and you feel safer, but it's that initial education, I think, that needs to be dealt with.
I think that goes without saying, but though maybe not. And there are ways in which we can be doing that. So we were talking earlier about make space safe for girls, which some of you also may have heard of. Make Space for Girls is about creating space, redesigning playgrounds so that they're not designed around a male norm. There was an example we were discussing before the talk started where a group of girls were asked to design their idea of a perfect playground, and what they designed was what they were used to. And then the people facilitating it said to them, "No, is this actually what you really want?" And they said, "Well, no, but this is what we think a playground is." And And they went, okay, well, if you were designing it for you, what would you design? And they designed something completely different. Now that is co-creation. So it's a question of how you do the education. In the last 30, 40 years, we've had a real hostility to the idea of creative learning. We've had the imposition of education policies which are very much learning by handing down, by structuring a curriculum in a very prescriptive way. So the national curriculum, I don't think is designed to do this kind of thing. It doesn't have the flexibility. So we would need not only to introduce these kinds of things, we need to rethink our approach to education, because our approach to education has become too prescriptive. And I mean, as human beings, we're problem-solving animals. That's how we've advanced. So if we structure education more around how do we solve problems, and this is a problem, then you can get really creative responses from children. And you can see examples where this has been done as a project. But maybe what we need to do is go, actually, we need more project learning within schools, right from Key Stage 1. Not least because if you think about it, I think it's something like 20% of the graduate level jobs in this country now are project related. People are working in project teams. The nature of the design of offices has changed because we work so much more in project teams now. So if you get kids to understand these things as projects and think, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve your problem, for instance? Then maybe we will be addressing that issue because they will internalize it, they will reconfigure their neural nets, rather than, so I'd rather do that than say, okay, well, let's have a bit tacked onto the national curriculum where some teacher who hasn't really thought about it very much somehow tries to shoehorn it into the end of a class or something. It's much, I mean, that's one of the reasons why citizenship education, as introduced by the Blair government, didn't work as well as it should have done. We haven't really got people thinking more about, well, what does it mean to be an active citizen? Whereas if we get people to learn kinesthetically, learning by doing, then hopefully we can achieve that more. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much, and I think that's probably about...
I'm happy to take more questions.
I'm not sure whether we might get thrown out. Any more burning questions, or should we... Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, Pippa. It was fascinating. Thank you so much.
I hope everyone thinks that as well.
Well, I think they're all sitting here absolutely holding on to your every word, so I think we all think it's fascinating. So thank you, and if we give a round of applause, please, for Pippa. Thank you so much.